Coming to you from beautiful Vancouver, Canada, this is Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here's your host, Mark Daly.
Hello and welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. My name is Mark Daly, I'm your host, and once again I'm joined by Kevin Laramée from the beautiful city of Montreal, Quebec. How are you doing today, Kevin?
I'm doing a lot better. I finally caught up on some sleep because let's just say last weekend I didn't get a lot of it.
And it was definitely a good race to stay up and watch the qualifying and the race itself here. I know out here on the west coast of Canada, it was on about, I think it was 11 o'clock Saturday night. Not terribly late for a weekend, but it does tend to get a little bit later when you're 3 hours ahead out in Montreal, but definitely worth every second of it. And that race, we'll talk about it here in a minute, but we could literally talk lap by lap, corner by corner. There was so much action, so much racing. There were so many talking points. It was one of the best races in recent memory.
Even though Nico Rosberg totally dominated the weekend, it really felt like it was an open race. It really felt like it was anything could happen. It was the unexpected was expected, and that was actually fun to see. And this season of F1 is actually shaping up to be one to remember for the right and the, I don't want to say the wrong reason, but the not pure reason, as is for different rules and different aspect of the race that makes it interesting. But yeah, it's shaping up to be quite a season.
Definitely, and you mentioned it. Nico Rosberg was absolutely dominant on Sunday afternoon. He actually was beat into the first corner by Daniel Ricciardo in the Red Bull, who beat him off of the line from second place on the starting grid. And Red Bull has actually been a bit of a surprise. Last year, obviously, they had a poor year by their lofty standards, but I think that they've got a better car that most people expected that they would have, and perhaps even Red Bull themselves to a certain degree. We saw Danny Kvyat finish P3, and meanwhile, Ricciardo himself finished fourth for the third race in a row, but he could have been a lot higher because, as I mentioned, he did get off the line quick. He was leading the Grand Prix and unfortunately had a tire puncture. He lost a tire, yeah. And that was unfortunate. So he did very well to claw his way all the way back up to fourth place. And I think that despite Nico Rosberg just running away with it at the moment, I mean, he's miles ahead of everybody else in the Drivers' Championship at the moment. He's got 75 points ahead of his teammate who's got 39. And it's just, it was impressive. But it is interesting how when you kind of maybe just take Nico out of the picture, how the racing further down the pack is so tight, and we see so much overtaking and guys just fighting for positions all the way down. It's really turning out to be a good season that way.
Yeah, if you look at the final result of the Chinese Grand Prix, outside of Nico Rosberg, Vettel, Kvyat, Ricciardo, Raikkonen, Massa, and Hamilton, even Verstappen, you can almost go to Sainz and Bottas, had to fight for those final position. They overtook somebody else for that final position. It wasn't just luck and coming out in the pit. No, they had to work for those final position. The sixth position of Williams, Felipe Massa, in his beautiful Martini car, by the way. What a beautiful design that car has. And it's just not because of the Martini and it looks kind of classy now, but they had to work for everything in that race. If you're looking at Danny Kvyat with a very bold move, which was legal, the space was there, even though Vettel might not agree. It was a great move in the first corner to overtake anyone. Ricciardo was already up there with a great start. So the two Red Bulls had a very impressive start of this Grand Prix. And I think that Red Bull car, like you mentioned, is maybe a lot closer to the Ferraris and especially to the Mercedes than we anticipated.
Definitely. And it's interesting that you bring up Danny Kvyat in the first corner there, because I don't know if you saw the post race. I was almost going to say post match. So awesome. I'm getting my sports confused here, but
it was almost a match. It was almost a fight because of it was a confrontation. And this beautiful way that they do, it's a closed room, no interviewers, but the room is mic'd and the room is there's camera in it. And as soon as they come out of the race, they take their helmets off, they're shaking it off.
No more smiles.
No, they're put there and they're basically emotions are let to talk. And you saw Vettel talking to Kvyat, dude, that was bold. What were you doing? You made me run into my teammate, even because yes, we didn't talk about it, but Vettel ran into Kimi. Kimi went away, lost a lot of position, had to battle to finish fifth. But Vettel blamed Kvyat for that move. Kvyat said, "Look, dude, we're racing. It's a race. The open space was there. I took it. I'm young. I am brash. I am bold. What are you going to do about it?" And Vettel had the final laugh because he's second and Danny Kvyat is third. But it's a type of move that gets you on the podium. And look, it's a type of move that got him on that podium.
Definitely. And I totally agree with you because Vettel did leave the door open. There was enough track there that he didn't have to force his way through. He saw the space. And when Kimi came across, Vettel, I think he was pinched on both sides by both cars. But
I think Vettel was surprised and he didn't have to hit Kimi. There was enough space for all three cars. That's the thing if you look at the replay in slow motion. But I think he was surprised and hit that steering wheel just a little too hard. And those steering wheels are so sensitive that he just hit Kimi. But yeah, he was really surprised by that move.
It is, and once again, it's disappointing for Ferrari and their fans because they've had the performance, they've been in good positions in all of the races so far this year, and they've been let down for one reason or another. And we had Kimi Räikkönen's engine let go in the first race in Australia, and then Vettel was chasing Hamilton for P2 right at the end of the race, and then made an uncharacteristic mistake and then put a couple of wheels onto the grass. And then we see again at China that mistake in the first corner. And that has to be the cardinal sin in racing, is to hit your teammate.
Especially if you're with Ferrari.
Especially if you're Ferrari, and especially if the big boss of Fiat is there. And he was saying after the race.
That man looks intimidating. I saw him pre-race. Actually, no, it was a recorded interview when he was coming out of the F1 rules and strategy for 2017 meeting that was before the qualifying process on Saturday. And Marquisio's name?
Marconi.
Forget his name. Marconi.
Yeah.
Exactly. Marconi is very intimidating. He was telling the reporters, look, we need success now. I'm not going to stand for it. Watch out. There's going to be things done, things change, but Ferrari needs to be back on that first step of the podium. And he was very categoric about it and quite an intimidating man.
Absolutely. And I was reading today that Ferrari reckon they're only 1/10 of a second off the pace of the Mercedes, but that's just speculation. That's their word at the moment because we actually haven't really seen them in a fair fight. And as I mentioned, they've let themselves down a couple of times over the first couple of races. And that definitely, I think that you can say that Vettel really, really worked hard for that P2. And later on in the race, he actually had another coming together with Valtteri Bottas in almost the same corner where he had the coming together with his teammate. And his front wing wasn't broken, but it was damaged. The end plate was gone, and it must have been a fairly difficult car to drive. But also in that first corner, Lewis Hamilton, who was at the very back of the pack, because first of all, he was going to lose 5 places in qualifying because of a gearbox change, and then he wasn't actually able to set a time in the qualifying because he had a power unit failure and he didn't even set a time. So it was very unusual to see basically a Mercedes sandwich with one at the very front and one at the very back. And then Lewis also had his nose damaged, his front wing damaged in the very first corner of the coming together, one of the Saubers. And he did very well to finish in P7. I don't know if there was any damage to his car, but he did very well to get where he was. But he just could not get around Felipe Massa and the Williams, no matter how hard he tried, and he just didn't have the pace to do it. But Massa was driving a very wide car, and there was going to be very little chance for Lewis to get around at any point. But that was it was an impressive drive, I think, from Lewis, but also disappointing for him because P7 means that he's just losing all that many more points to his teammate. And I think it's fair to say that nobody has really challenged Nico Rosberg so far this year.
No, and it's going to be maybe a long time before somebody does, just because of the gap that he already has established. We're talking about a gap over 30 points now. So not even 40 points, if I'm not mistaken, between him and Hamilton in second. One of the things that's interesting, too, you mentioned the change of the gearbox for Lewis Hamilton, because if you look at the upcoming races, they knew they were going to have to change one. So they say, why not change it now when we can maybe get most of it? Because we're going to have to change it probably before Montreal anyway. So timing-wise, why not do it now? And if you're looking at the actual race schedule, you take it backwards. You go with your 5 allowed change and you put them where you think they see fit to have a good working one at the right time for the right track to get the most out of your car. So it's interesting they decided to do now before the Chinese Grand Prix.
Yeah, and it made sense from a timing point of view, as you say. It's just unfortunate from Lewis's point of view that his engine also had a letdown and was not able to perform, because I don't ever recall seeing a Mercedes that far back at the very back of the grid like that. But he definitely did work hard to get back where he was. And I thought that, well, I mean, it's lucky that it was on a relatively short track like the Chinese Grand Prix. If it was like in 2014 at Spa-Francorchamps, when he had the coming together with Nico Rosberg and Nico ended up with a punctured tire on the very first lap, you still have several miles of that winding remote circuit to drive around to get back to the pit. So if it's a normal track like China, at least if you have to go in for a nose like that, at least you're not losing all that time and distance. So that was at least in his favor. And then, of course, what also worked in his favor was when there was a safety car, because there was just so much debris on the track from all the different collisions there in those first couple of corners that they just decided that they had to do something about it. It was just like in qualifying when they actually had to shut it down.
To stop the session. Yeah, like in Q1, they had to stop the session.
That's right.
And it cost Jenson Button a good time, probably, which he finished 13, but Jenson Button allegedly had a very powerful car, and he was really mad, if not to use the P word, during this qualification process. If you listen to the radio on the Sky Sports F1 broadcast, he was really mad that he couldn't finish that session and couldn't get a time before that's the end of that session because of the Q1 stoppage.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of the reason that there was so much like turmoil at the start of the Chinese Grand Prix, was just because of the way that the qualifying was interrupted, that there were a lot of cars that were back further in the...
They were faster, but they were stuck in the back, and they had to overtake slower cars. Yeah.
Yeah, and it really made for an interesting start, but that safety car also, to get back to my original point, was that also played into Lewis Hamilton's hands, because not only did he have to go in and lose time to change his front nose cone and the wing and get all repaired and get back out on the track, and he didn't lose all that distance because, what was it, 4 or 5 laps later is when they actually brought the safety car out, and then all the cars closed up, and that was just perfect for Lewis Hamilton.
And it was too late for Ricciardo, and the damage was already done. His tire blew up, and it was basically probably caused, we don't have that on camera, but we saw the debris there, and we saw a car having a puncture that literally the tire just flew off. The outside gum of the tire just flew off, everything else exploded, and he was on the rim for half a lap. It's a good thing that his car wasn't damaged too much, because he eventually finished 4th, just outside the podium. But can you imagine if that didn't happen, how fast and how maybe 3rd and maybe even 2nd he would have been?
Well, that's correct. Ricciardo himself said after the Grand Prix that he believes that puncture actually cost him a 2nd place, and that would have been incredible to see perhaps maybe 2 Red Bulls on the podium and maybe no Ferraris. It's interesting to see or speculate how that race might have turned out otherwise, but it was very interesting to watch some of the other cars throughout the pack. We saw that Romain Grosjean and the Haas just struggled all race long. I think it was a bit of a reality check for them. I mean, he had...
Welcome to F1.
No kidding.
4 Grand Prix in, but welcome to F1.
Well, Gutierrez, his teammate, had a fairly good race. I think he finished, it was 14th in the end. So, I mean, well down in the order, but not quite as impressive as Roman was in the first couple of races of the year. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not they can turn it around at Sochi the week after, well, next weekend. It's not the week after next. That kind of puts it away. It's this very dense schedule has kind of got my timing thrown off a little bit.
It's the biggest season in history of F1, Mark. 21 races, 21 Grand Prix. It's going to be the biggest season ever. And of course, that's why we're talking about it. But yeah, it's crazy the amount of races this year.
Yeah, it's funny because the season always starts about the middle of March. And to think that they'll be going right till about the time that I'm starting to get out my Christmas decorations and start putting up my Christmas lights at the very end of November. I think what is the last race? I think it's November 27th.
I do
off
believe
the
so,
top of my head. Something like that. That is one very, very long season. And that leads to another point of discussion that's come up quite a lot, and it was mentioned on the broadcast and in the press several times that Nico has now won X number of races going back to last year, and the driver that wins so many races in a row at the start of a season, always goes on to win a world championship. But I think that Nico himself was very guarded, and I think he was very down to earth about it. He said, well, first of all, none of those drivers had a teammate who was Lewis Hamilton. And the other point, which I think is a great point, because we haven't seen Lewis really have the circumstances where he's best to do the things that he does, and
he's still second in the championship.
Exactly. So he's in a bit of a tough spot right now, but that has to turn around at some point, and that leads into what we were just talking about. Not only is his teammate Lewis Hamilton, but Lewis Hamilton still has about 18 Grand Prix to catch up and maybe win another world title. So it is
still got a full season if we go back to prior statistics, plus one races. We're all used to a 17, maybe 18 race season. 21 this year. There's still a whole season left, so we're still like in the beginning of the season.
Exactly. If this was maybe the middle of summer or August, or maybe even going into September, sure. But when you're 3 races into a 21 race season, to even bring up those statistics are it's very premature, and I can understand and respect Nico's point of view that sure, he's had a great start to the season, but let's not put the cart before the horse.
No, exactly. No, absolutely. One point, Mark, that really impressed me is, the coverage of Sky Sports F1 is top notch. It's one of maybe the best coverage of any sports I've ever seen. And it made the experience of that Shanghai Grand Prix even more enjoyable. But the look, the feel, the way it was built, it was basically built in specs to F1. And it's very interesting to have the Grand Prix there, the feeling of the fan, the support. Every team has its own support. And it's kind of very interesting the way it was built. And it made for actually very entertaining qualifying and a race.
Definitely. And of course, China is one of these emerging countries in the world. I mean, obviously it's not a poor country or anything like that, but it is one of these countries that there's a lot of people there, obviously, and there's a lot of people that are tech savvy. There's a lot of people with money there nowadays. So it makes sense to go there. And of course, people who follow us and on the soccer side, we constantly talk about players that are going to the Chinese Super League and how some of the clubs over there have very big pockets. So it is very smart for them to get into that market, and it'll be good for them to keep going back there. I actually quite like the track. I think that back straight that's over a kilometer long and goes into that very tight hairpin that, well, it's not quite 180 degrees by the time they get around it, makes for a great place for some passing. And we saw many, many passes there this past weekend.
If you're a little bit wide, it leaves a big open space for somebody that wants to risk it. And if you're willing to maybe take the outside of the turn, to take the outside of the actual turn itself wide, you can actually get really close inside of the end of that vibrator. So it really helps to continue and push to overtake someone. And we saw that at that hairpin. It was very interesting.
Definitely. And that kind of leads into another discussion now about the rule changes that are going to come in for 2017. Mercedes boss Toto Wolff said that he doesn't really see the point of this drastic change for 2017 because now the new rules that they've brought in 2 or 3 years ago now have sort of settled down. And we've seen this year that this is so far the best season with the racing, very close racing in all 3 Grand Prix so far this year. And he doesn't see that perhaps it would be such a great thing to completely upset everything for 2017 and beyond. What do you think about that?
What it really piqued my attention was the Pirelli tire representative that we're talking about the changes they're going to do for the tires next year. Tires that are more durable, less degrading, so that drivers can achieve higher speeds on them and be more confident in the tires. And they're looking at about way wider tires, a little bit more bigger tires and wider to have more traction, to have maybe the 7 to 10 inches wider cars as well, to have a better grip on the track to get more speed. Those technical aspects of the car could be interesting for the look of it, for the speed aspect too, because now with they're so narrow that you maybe lose the speed aspect when you're looking at a race. But that being said, I don't necessarily like the canopy maybe aspect, or because it gets gimmicky and is going to get oily and dusty. That's the reason why it's not there anymore. So those type of things maybe worry me, but the idea of bigger, stronger tires to make for a better grip on the track, that is almost a necessity.
Yeah, so it makes you wonder whether or not they're going to change or not, because Wolff said, and he made a good point, because he was just like, and maybe he's protecting Mercedes' interest, because obviously they've gotten it right under the current rules. But he was saying that if they go to another switch, there might be one team that gets out ahead, and then you might have the same resets, if you will, going back 2 or 3 years to when these rules came in, and one team will be dominant, and then it'll take a couple of years for the other teams to catch up. He was almost suggesting that perhaps they push those new rules off another year or something, and give these another year, and just let it sort of play out. But he does have a point to a certain degree. I mean, obviously, we've seen how dominant Mercedes has been for the last 2 or 3 years, and again this past weekend. But once you get away from Mercedes, and even when you see the Mercedes in traffic, it when it's out front in clean air, it's a very good car. But there's some speculation that Lewis Hamilton, even though he had his wing knocked off in the first corner, that his car wasn't that badly damaged, and that just when you get into the dirty air and you get into traffic, that perhaps the Mercedes isn't the quickest car. So if somebody could catch up to them, like we've seen with the Ferrari with more pace, and we've seen with the Red Bull with more pace, perhaps we'd see somebody else out in the front there. And if somebody could just get in front of Nico Rosberg, maybe it would just upset the entire apple cart and turn the whole thing on its head. So we'll see. Yeah. We'll see. There's still, as we say, about 17 or 18 races left in the year, so it could happen.
No, and I still believe that we haven't seen a full 100% capacity of any of the opponent of the Mercedes, and the gap we see might be bigger. It's bigger in perception than in reality is, probably because there was outside factors in the results of other cars, like Vettel finished second. He didn't have a fair shot to beating Rosberg with the way that he hit Kimi Räikkönen in the beginning, and those type of accident happened for every opponent of Rosberg so far as well at the beginning of the season. So there's that aspect that we haven't seen the full potential of all the other cars towards that Mercedes, because there's been outside maybe intervention or outside interference. Now, if we put those cars side by side, the gap might not be as big. So that's going to be interesting. The other thing that caught my attention, Mark, was there's a big testing that's been approved by all the big F1 team, and there's going to be a lot of money involved. I think it's over $20 million to test for 7 to 10 days on tracks with different cars, with different specs, the new tires for 2017 to make them more reliable. And there's been millions of dollars invested by Pirelli itself, about $2 million, but by other big cars and other big manufacturers. If we look about Ferrari, Mercedes, all those companies invested millions of dollars into that testing. And the data, though, is not going to be solely for the team that invested. It's going to be open for every team. So every team is going to get the result of that testing. So nobody gets an unfair advantage heading into 2017. But it's good to see that they're testing quite early in this season the specs for the tires for next year to finally get it right. Because yes, it's exciting, it's fun, but if you're looking at example of what happened to Ricciardo, easily his tires shredded. And if you're looking at the super soft, the amount of time that they're at their full potential on the track, you can count those laps almost on one hand. Outside of that, they lose and they start to degrade. And before they get to temperature, they don't have that same effectiveness. So at least those testing is probably going to figure out those tires for next year. And that is going to mean more overtaking, more speed. And if the drivers are more confident in their tires, they're going to try other maneuver that they're maybe scared to trying, or to shy away from trying for not losing contact with the track.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I know that you hear comments from the drivers from time to time, and I read it several times over the last couple of days, that there's just complaints in the quality of the Pirelli tires just in general, and they just don't think that they're just a good tire to begin with. And it's interesting also to see how the tires, once they get sort of a half a lap, they get up to the temperature, how they get really grippy, and then they drop off, and then they sort of get some grip back before they completely lose it. And then, of course, we saw Sebastian Vettel's big tire failure last year at Spa-Francorchamps as well, very similar to Daniel Ricciardo, although that was right at the very end of the race, and that kind of spoiled things for him, whereas
it's even more heartbreaking.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at least with the Ricciardo, he had basically about 90% of the race still to run. But it's also looking ahead to 2017. There's been some computer modeling done of the new cars and what they expect and what possibly could happen. But they were looking at some modeling at the Grand Prix track at Barcelona in Spain, and they were saying that in turn 3 they were expecting that this cornering speeds could increase up to 40 or 45 kilometers an hour. They were saying something. I think that corner at Barcelona is currently taken at about 235 kilometers an hour, and I think under the new format, the new cars, that it would be much closer to 270 kilometers an hour with a lateral load of 5.5 Gs, which just seems absolutely mind-bending just to even look at those numbers. So.
But I think it's positive. And you know why, Mark? Because if you're looking at lap times and achievement of motor racing, usually F1 was the pinnacle of design, the pinnacle of engineering, the pinnacle of racing in itself, which means the highest, best pieces and gears and engines and engineer and everybody in the F1 world was the best at its field. And that resulted in the best cars and best times. And now times are 8, 9, 10 seconds slower than a few years ago. We're not looking at the pinnacle of racing anymore. When I'm looking at the Formula E, the electric car formula, in a way, they're the pinnacle of racing in a way because they're at the pinnacle of electric cars. They're pushing the boundaries of electric car. And I want to see Formula One pushing the boundaries of regular car to make those cars as eco-friendly as they can. Yes, because that's going to be able to help future car companies down the line, 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. It's going to be helpful for the entire human population if you can make a fast engine that are more eco-friendly. And those development in technology happens usually in F1. And we need to get that idea and that technology back into it. And to be able to push the boundaries, you need to be able to go far, to go fast, to push the boundaries of what you can do. And I think that's the right idea heading to the next year's car design. And that may be a little bit of the idea behind it too.
Definitely. I totally agree with you that Formula One is the pinnacle of motorsport. I remember going back 20 years ago when you saw things like traction control and this active suspension and the introduction of the paddle shift and things like that. And I remember thinking, wow, that is radical. That is so cool. And I look nowadays when I just get in my car to go down to the grocery store, go to work in my Mitsubishi, I have paddle shift, I have traction control and all these things. So, I mean, the trickle down obviously takes a little while from Formula One to a road car. But that was something 20 years ago I never thought I would see in my own car. And nowadays,
well, just if you're looking at the DRS system, if you're looking at the hybrid car nowadays and how it preserves and regenerates energy by collecting the movement kinetic energy of the wheels while it's powered by the other motor, that's a type of DRS. And it was invented not necessarily primary by F1, but F1 pushed it to another limit. But those type of advancement technology happen in F1 usually before everywhere else. And I think F1 not necessarily have gone away from it. They're in the cost-cutting aspect of F1, which is great. You need to cut costs because it was extravagant. I have to agree there. But I think there's a middle that needs to be found where soufflerie, wind tunnels are important, testing, trying to push the boundaries. That costs a lot of money too. And down the road, the benefit outweighs the actual investment to begin with. So no, I think F1 needs definitely to go back to trying to be the pinnacle of motor engine racing.
And definitely, they also want to reduce lap times by up to 5 seconds a lap by 2017, so they're well on the way to there. And I also agree with that being the pinnacle of motorsport, because part of the technology and all the extravagant and the cool gadgets and technology that we see in Formula One cars, that's also part of the draw and the part of the attractiveness of the
appeal.
sport. Yeah, part of the appeal, absolutely. And also, as we start to wrap things up here, there was news this week that the mayor of Monza believes that there is a good chance that the race will come back for 2017, despite Bernie Ecclestone saying that it's not a given that they will go back there next year. How important do you think it is to have Formula One go to some of these spiritual homes of Grand Prix racing, and Monza in Italy has to be one of the most iconic tracks in all of motorsport. They've been there.
Nürburgring,
yeah, and I mean they've been there every year since the World Championship, and it started in 1950. How important do you think it is for them to stay there rather than to maybe go to Las Vegas, who apparently have a contract for a Grand Prix and nobody really knew about it?
I think it's very important, even though this track doesn't have the same path. What's the word? The same design as it used to be. It was almost an oval before, but the way
Mhm.
this track is laid out, it's still very impressive with that straightaway curve that it's in Monza. Gets a lot of speed. It's a hotbed of Formula One, the Tifosi, and all this is a lot of history. I think it's important, and I think you mentioned going to legendary tracks. I think there's you have to take teams and put them out of their comfort zone because as more you want to make it interesting, if you go to track that are all the same, it's all the same. I think tracks that are legendary, and I'm going to name a couple of tracks here that haven't seen F1 maybe in years, and that the actual length maybe has not the best suited for Formula One track or whatever. But there's things you could do. Example, like the Nürburgring. Of course, you're not going to drive the whole 27 miles of the possible track that it can have, but there's a configuration of that track that you can do to make it a longer track than everywhere else, but maybe 25 laps is the entirety of the track, but that makes for a different race that needs to be approached differently, and different cars can maybe perform differently at that track. If you're looking at an American track, there's a lot of races that were etched in my mind from Laguna Seca.
Yes, yeah.
That track is mythical with the drop, and yes, a lot of
The
unfortunately,
corkscrew or whatever it's called.
the corkscrew have caught a couple of lives, unfortunately, but that track is something special. Can you imagine F1 cars on this track that has a maybe wider tires, example like starting next year or in the future? That track can bring something else, and it has an identity to itself. And if all those track are different, it would literally feels like a world tour because the track, if the cars need to adapt to the tracks cannot adapt to the cars. And over the years, since like after the mid 90s, with all the new tracks that we've seen built to custom spec for F1, it's a track that were adapted to the cars, and it made for boring races and it made for cookie cutter races that were all similar. You need to adapt the cars to the track, and for this, you need track with identity. Go to Road America in Mid Ohio. Go to Laguna Seca. I know those are different type of tracks, but that's the point. Monaco is the exact example of this. When you have a track that's so different from the other ones, you have a different feel to this race. And imagine if you have, of course, there's going to be 8 European races that are similar, fine, but 10 very identical. An identity different for every race can be so impressive. You have Indonesia, the Malaysian Grand Prix look very different. You have Laguna Seca, Road America, Monaco, Montreal, Nürburgring with maybe a 10-mile configuration that could be very challenging for the car. That would make a world championship so much more interesting, and that would maybe attract more fans in other branches of motor racing because it would be similar to the other type of racing.
Yeah, and just talking about the tracks that maybe have lost something, I think Hockenheim has to be counted one of those.
Mm-hmm.
I went there, I think probably one of the last years.
France.
Yep, and Magny-Cours is another one. I was at Hockenheim about 10 or 15 years ago, right before they changed the configuration. It was still the old one where the cars would come through by the pits and then they'd go around the corner and then disappear for a couple of minutes through the forest and then come back. Of course, the new configuration where they cut down most of the forest and things like that, it makes it for a better spectator experience if you're there. But the new layout, I don't particularly like it. It was pretty cool the way it was. So
why is there not a race at Le Mans? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Imagine here, hypothetical word, you and me, Mark, and I know we're going off the cuff here and we're in extra time here on Scuderia F1 podcast, but imagine this world championship in F1. You have Magny-Cours, Hockenheim, Nürburgring, Australian Grand Prix. It's a great race, but you have like Laguna Seca, Road America, an oval. Out of the blue, you put an oval race in the F1 Grand Prix, it would make it feel like events. Every single race would feel so much bigger. It'd be like, oh, how are they going to adapt to this race? It's very different. They only turn left on this one because, the adaptation of the car, that would make so much more intriguing. And I think this one needs to be done to spark the imagination and maybe bring this sport to a higher level than it has ever been.
It'd be like the 60s again when you get like Formula One drivers going over to race at Indianapolis. It'd be pretty cool, wouldn't
exactly,
it? Yeah.
Exactly. Why not? Have one race in Indianapolis and get all those great legends of the racing back into racing. And there's history. Can you imagine the packages of TV can be done? Oh, the first race in the Brickyard for a long time. they channel the spirit of a Jacques Villeneuve in 94, 95, the things they could do with the possibilities. And I think maybe they're talking about opening the imagination for the rules. Maybe they open the imagination of how they do races. Don't go to a place where they give you the most amount of money to put a race. Go to a place where they can give you the best race. And sometimes it starts with the track itself.
Yeah, and I think that would help attract a lot of new fans as well. All right, well, I think that's a good place to leave it for this episode. Kevin, before we go, do you want to let everybody know where they can find you online?
Absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter at Kev Laramée, and you can find everything we do on the Sports Podcasting Network on sportspodcastingnetwork.com.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And of course, if you want to find us on Twitter, we're at Scuderia F1 Pod, and you can also find us online on the internet at www.scuderiaf1pod.com. Once again, I'm your host, Mark Daly. That's a wrap for episode number 5. We'll catch you again next time.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.